Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome once again to the story of Pensacola, North America's first place city, where this week we are talking about the history of education in our community. And in our last episode we talked about how the county itself was almost bare of formal education up until the 1870s. And that at that point in time, with the use of a very small amount of money, a system was started where classes were being conducted in private homes, and that really didn't work too well. We had fewer than 250 students altogether enrolled by the time we reached the mid-1880s, and it was in 1885, right in the middle of that decade, that Florida passed a new constitution, and that provided for several things. Number one, the ability of a county to assess ad valorem tax charges to support education, and in that time they also provided for the election rather than the appointment of the school board, and then the school board itself would appoint the superintendent. And so from that point on, the school board chose Mr. Nathan B. Cook, who would be our superintendent, incidentally, for 28 years. And Mr. Cook is really the father of the system in Escambia County. And by the time we get into the early 1890s, we have more than 50 schools functioning, many of them small 1- and 2-room affairs out in the county, and we had a total of just over 80 teachers. Well, as we pass through these years, other things are beginning to happen that are of considerable interest. Now Mr. Cook is insisting on more and more of a formal curriculum. And I apologize for doing this, but my memory fails me a little bit when we come to a lot of these texts. But I think it would be interesting for you to understand what kind of books Mr. Cook insisted upon. Basically, they were these. The primary six were Barnes' Reading Chart, Swinton's Word Primer, Dinsmore's Spelling Book, Barnes' Elementary Geography, the McGuffey's Eclectic Speller, and then Barnes' Elementary Geography. These were the fundamentals, and as I believe we mentioned in the first episode, at this point in time, and this was all the way through Mr. Cook's administration, the county did not provide textbooks for the students. This was the responsibility of the parents. And of course, we also mentioned last time that to begin supporting the school system, or systems, I guess we ought to call them, the county was divided into as many as 27 different districts, and each district set its own ad valorem tax level to the degree that they needed money to provide the school system. A typical situation like this, of course, came in the year 1900, when the Alger Sullivan Lumber Company was created, and the people of the new little town of Century came to the school board and said, we need a school up here very badly. And so an agreement was made very nicely between the school board and Mr. DeHouse at Alger Sullivan, and Alger Sullivan's company literally built the schoolhouse, and then the school system provided the teacher. And once again, they had the same system up there as they had throughout the rest of the county. The people of the community paid the room and board and supported the teachers as they were on station and were teaching there. Well, as we move through the early years of the 20th century, the school system grows step by step. And one thing that Mr. Cook was very good at, he kept his ear to the ground, knowing what was happening in other systems that were comparable. And he began, for example, going to various merchants and asking them to offer prizes for excellence in certain types of school work. And so jewelry shops and others began to say, well, we will give the annual medal, or we will give a nice new watch to the student who does best in such and such. And I can remember one of the jewelry shops, the shop offered a medal each year that was given for excellence in spelling. And then, of course, a little bit later than that, another merchant did them a little better because they began to hold an annual spelling bee, and the spelling bee was a public affair, and of course all the parents could proudly watch as their children competed. In addition to that sort of thing, we begin to see sports in action. Now, we have record of the existence of our Pensacola High School by the mid-1890s, and it was a very lovely three-story wooden building that was erected on East Wright Street near the depot. And the story comes as early as 1902. We have some records, even some photographs of boys who were playing major sports, particularly football, and were competing with other schools outside the county. We did not have a number of schools in our own community until maybe almost 8 or 9 years after that. And by the time we get into the early part of the second decade of the 20th century, we have additional schools here because we have now created Washington High School. We have also have what they call Muskogee High School, and of course Tate High School itself. So basically, we began having a 4-school system, but I don't have record that they competed too highly against each other. Well, also in the same period, we are looking at a situation where the status of teachers is beginning to improve. By now, Mr. Cook has succeeded. He's elevated the standard for teachers, and by the time we get to the year 1910, an average school teacher was on an annual contract, and that contract, on average, called for a salary of about $240 per year. Now, bear in mind, some of these folks also had room and board if they were teaching out in the county. Okay, we move up to the year 1912. In that year, the Florida legislature decided to make a change. And they said that beginning in this year, in the elections of the fall of 1912, the position of superintendent will become elective in all of the counties, which meant that Mr. N.B. Cook, who had been the appointed superintendent through all of these 28 years, now had to stand for election, and he had competition. The man was named A.S. Edwards, and Mr. Edwards had been the bookkeeper for the school system. And they went to the polls, or got ready to go to the polls, and Mr. Cook said, look, everybody knows me. There's no sense in the world am I spending money on electioneering. Everybody knows me. If they want me, they'll keep me. But they did not. Mr. Edwards won the election. He campaigned very vigorously, and A.S. Edwards became the superintendent. Well, Edwards was a very far-sighted man. He would be superintendent for the first time for 6 years, and then he would also be superintendent a second time much later in the 20th century. Very able man, and in the early part of the second decade, he moves to a new system of transportation. It is then and only then, and of course, bear in mind, this is 12, 13 years after we began to see gasoline-powered vehicles in the county. Now the county the county school board agrees that they will spend money to buy school buses. They did. They bought 6 at one time, and they paid a grand total of $7,500 for the buses. Now, I wish I could tell you that they were an immediate success. They weren't, because the roads, of course, outside of Pensacola were very poor, and they had all kinds of trouble in wet and rainy weather. And then the engines were not always faithful, and of course the farmers were up in arms about this because that meant that the kids got home late to do the chores. And for a number of years, the idea of the buses was not exactly a popular one, but step by step it grew. And we're looking at our present time, well into the 21st century, they have almost 100 school buses going back and forth carrying children in Escambia County. Well, by the time we reached 1919, we have a new school board. Again, I want to stress this, all through these years, the men who have been the elected school board members have been prominent local citizens. They received nothing for their pay, and in each instance, these were men who were dedicated. Many of them served a good many years in office. These men like A.V. Clubs and George Saltmarsh and people like that, they were not just in and out of the office. They were there year after year, illustrating their dedication. And we have to remember, up until well into the 1950s, the school board conducted almost all of the paperwork and what we would today call the staff functions behind the superintendent. The superintendent didn't even have a secretary, and it would be almost 1940 before the first typewriter was purchased on which they could keep records for their own purposes. But in any event, by the time we get to 1919, our school board has some new names on it, and one of them, of course, is well known. His name was E. Dixie Beggs. This is E. Dixie Beggs, the senior, and John H. Pace was one, and L.S. Gilmore. They were the three school board members in 1919, and we want to mention them because they came across a very difficult situation. In mid-year, just before the fall term was to begin, the high school caught fire. It burned to the ground. And of course, they were now facing what are we going to do? We've been building schools successively here. What are we going to do? We have no high school. But they were lucky. Just about a year and a half before, Pensacola had been visited by what we would today call an evangelist. He was a man with a riveting personality, and people just loved to hear him. And to keep him here after his basic service had about to expire, they built a tabernacle. And this was on the corner, basically on the corner of Balin Street and Gregory. A big building, open would seat several hundred people. And by now, of course, the evangelist had, after the fire, the evangelist had left, and so the school board quickly contracted to use that building. They quickly rushed in, put partitions in it, and the tabernacle thus was the high school until the new building could be constructed. Now, as all of this was happening, the school board said, well, we have been going along year after year after year, spending very little, particularly inside the city itself, to provide modern facilities for our students. So at that point, they did something they had not done before, and that was they sold a bond issue. It was a large bond issue. It was sufficient funds to build what became known as Pensacola High School, P.K. Young Elementary School, and then A.V. Clubs and A.C. Blunt Middle Schools. And all of those fine new brick buildings of substantial size, they were being built at the same time. And early in 1922, Pensacola High School was completed with great ceremony, because they had some wonderful they had some innovations there that were just special. This was the first time that there was a gymnasium, and and also the first time that there was any kind of a school auditorium where plays and a total group, total student body and assembly could enjoy works together. Now, one of the interesting little sidelights to that, of course, came because when they finished the building, they discovered that they had not provided enough money to equip the gymnasium as it should be. And one of the members of the community who was most active in this sort of thing was a man named John Sherrill, who had been head of the YMCA here for many years. Mr. Sherrill had moved into the oil business, and he was a member of the relatively new Rotary Club. So he went to his fellow Rotarians, and working together, they raised $3,000, and they had all of that equipment, which they then turned over to the school system so they could equip their gymnasium, and of course they did. And it was, of course, you can imagine it was a great success. Well, after about the seventh year of his term, Mr. Edwards decided not to run for re-election. He was succeeded by a man named William Tyler, and Mr. Tyler would be our superintendent then for the next 11 years. Now, by this time, we've got a number of things that are happening. The numbers of schools, of course, have been slowly increasing. The size of some of them had increased as well. As I mentioned, with the new brick facilities that had been done in 1919, 2021. But beyond that, there was other things that first Mr. Edwards and then Mr. Tyler were putting in, that it is time for the students of this community to have more of a broadened education. So now we begin to teach music. We begin to teach art. We begin to have some classes in what we would today call home economics. And there was another one that the boys particularly loved that they called manual training. This is where they learned the fundamentals of carpentry and a few little home chores in plumbing and things of that kind. So all of this is being added to the curriculum of the school system, and it goes along extremely well. So we passed through the 1920s with not a whole lot of change that we could point fingers at. The numbers of students, of course, are rising. We have a ratio of schools that are specifically for white students of about 2 to 1 as opposed to the ones for colored students. And but basically the facilities as they are prepared for both white and colored are basically the same, with perhaps 1 or 2 differences within the city itself. Well, and we move through the 1920s, and we come, of course, to 1929, and then the school system, like everybody else, would be struck by the terrible economic woes of the Great Depression. And as we move into the 1930s, that's basically, our system is pretty much static. We have reached a point where we have over 80 schools, and we have about a little over 120 teachers, but that's basically where we stood when the Depression years began.